You are a queen, not a princess waiting for something to happen, not a consort standing beside the real power, a queen, crowned, documented, written into the official record of your civilization. And you have a girlfriend, not a rumor, not a modern interpretation of an ambiguous friendship, a documented, named, sometimes legally recognized relationship with another woman. A relationship that your court knew about, that your historians recorded, and that later historians spent considerable effort explaining away, reframing, or quietly removing from the version of events they passed down to the next generation. This video is about the queens they tried to erase twice. Once when they died, and once when someone decided their stories were inconvenient. Let's start with the oldest one. Ancient Egypt gave us one of the most debated royal women in history, and her name is not Cleopatra. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh for approximately 22 years, from around 1473 to 1458 BCE. She was not a regent. She was not filling in for a male heir. She ruled as pharaoh in her own right, wore the double crown, the false beard, the full regalia of Egyptian kingship, and conducted military campaigns, built monuments, and expanded trade routes that made Egypt significantly wealthier than it had been when she took power. She also had a woman named Senenmut in her life, in a capacity that Egyptian sources struggled to categorize cleanly. Senenmut was officially her chief steward and the tutor of her daughter Neferure. He held more titles than almost anyone else in the Egyptian court, over 80 titles documented across various sources, which is an extraordinary number even for a senior official. He was given the honor of placing his own image inside Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, an honor typically reserved for family members. His tomb was being constructed near hers at a time when proximity in death reflected the closeness of relationship in life. And then there are the graffiti. On the walls of unfinished tombs near Deir el-Bahri, ancient Egyptians scratched images that modern archaeologists have described as sexually explicit depictions involving a figure identified as Senenmut and a figure in royal female regalia. These were not official art. These were the equivalent of ancient gossip carved into stone by workers who clearly had opinions about what was happening in the palace. Historians have debated the nature of the Hatshepsut-Senenmut relationship for decades. The conventional explanation is that Senenmut was simply a remarkably trusted male advisor, and that the graffiti reflects malicious court rumors rather than reality. But here is what we know for certain. After Hatshepsut died, her successor Thutmose III conducted a systematic campaign to remove her from the record. Her statues were smashed, her images were chiseled off walls, her name was removed from inscriptions. The erasure was so thorough that for centuries, Egyptologists looking at the record could not figure out who had built her monuments or conducted her campaigns because her name simply was not there anymore. Whatever Hatshepsut was, someone worked very hard to make sure you would never know. Now let's cross to China. The Tang Dynasty produced one of the most powerful women in Chinese history, and her relationship with another woman is documented in court records that her own biographers found deeply uncomfortable. Wu Zetian ruled China first as Empress Consort, then as Empress Dowager, and finally, uniquely in Chinese history, as emperor in her own right, founding her own dynasty, the Zhou, in 690 CE. She held effective power over China for nearly half a century. She reformed the civil service, expanded the empire's borders, patronized Buddhism, and executed anyone she considered a serious threat with a thoroughness that the male emperors of her era would have recognized and respected. She also had a documented relationship with a woman named Shangguan Wan'er. Shangguan Wan'er was a poet and official whose grandmother had been executed on Wu Zetian's orders when Wan'er was an infant. Wan'er herself was taken into the palace as a slave. By the time she was 14, Wu Zetian had recognized her extraordinary literary talent and made her a personal secretary. By the time she was an adult, she was effectively Wu Zetian's chief of staff, drafting imperial edicts, managing correspondence, running the administrative machinery of the most powerful office in China. The Tang Huiyao, a Tang Dynasty administrative encyclopedia, records that Wu Zetian and Shangguan Wan'er shared sleeping quarters. Chinese historians of the period described their relationship using language that left little room for clinical interpretation. Later historians described it as a close working relationship and moved on quickly. What makes this case particularly interesting is what happened after Wu Zetian died. Shangguan Wan'er navigated the post-Wu political chaos with extraordinary skill, transferring her allegiances carefully, continuing to exercise influence under successive emperors. She was eventually executed in 710 CE during a coup, and her executioner was a prince who had been a political enemy of Wu Zetian's faction. When her tomb was discovered in 2013 in Shanxi province, archaeologists found it had been deliberately vandalized in antiquity. Her stone epitaph had been smashed into over 200 pieces. Someone had gone to considerable effort to damage the record of her existence. The pattern continues. Let's go to medieval Europe, specifically to the court of Eleanor of Castile and the women who surrounded her. But more precisely to a woman whose story almost no one tells. Christina of Sweden ruled as monarch from 1644 to 1654, making her one of the most educated and intellectually formidable rulers in European history. She corresponded with Descartes, invited him to Stockholm where he died of pneumonia within months of arrival, established Sweden as a center of European intellectual life, and collected art and manuscripts on a scale that transformed Swedish cultural patrimony. She also refused to marry any man, abdicated her throne rather than be forced into a marriage alliance, converted to Catholicism in a Lutheran kingdom, which was political suicide, and spent the rest of her life in Rome, surrounded by women she loved. The most documented of these relationships was with Ebba Sparre, a lady-in-waiting whom Christina called Belle, and wrote letters to that have survived. In these letters, Christina describes Ebba in terms that her contemporaries understood as romantic. She writes of her beauty, her virtue, of missing her presence, of the specific quality of her company that no one else could replace. She introduced Ebba to foreign dignitaries as her bed companion, a term that in 17th century Swedish court language meant exactly what it sounds like and was understood as such by everyone present. When Christina abdicated and left Sweden, she left Ebba behind. Ebba subsequently married a count. Christina's letters from exile describe this with a grief that does not read as the response to losing a close friend. Swedish historians of the 19th and 20th centuries describe Christina as eccentric, unstable, possibly mentally ill, and constitutionally unsuited to the demands of queenship. Her relationships with women were described as intense friendships characteristic of the era. The fact that she abdicated a throne rather than marry a man was attributed to her difficult personality rather than to the possibility that she simply did not want to spend her life married to one. She was erased not by having her name chiseled off a wall, she was erased by being pathologized. Now to the Ottoman Empire. The harem of the Ottoman sultans is one of the most misrepresented institutions in world history. European travelers and writers spent centuries projecting their own fantasies onto it, a place of passive, available women waiting for male attention. The reality was almost precisely the opposite. The harem was a sophisticated political institution. The women inside it, the sultan's mother, his wives, his concubines, his daughters, exercised enormous political power, controlled significant wealth, managed complex networks of patronage and alliance, and in many cases, effectively ran the empire while the sultan conducted military campaigns or simply found other things to do. And within this institution, relationships between women were documented, acknowledged, and in some cases, celebrated in poetry. The Haseki, the favored wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, was Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana. Harem was extraordinary by any measure. She convinced Suleiman to legally marry her, which was unprecedented for a concubine. She outlived her rivals through a combination of political skill, genuine affection from Suleiman, and a ruthlessness that her enemies consistently underestimated. But it is the women around harem, the network of relationships within the harem itself, that the Ottoman sources approach most carefully. The poetry produced within harem culture, by women, for women, in a space where men were almost entirely absent, uses the same language of desire, beauty, and longing that Ottoman male poets used when writing about women. The literary tradition of female same-sex desire within the harem was sufficiently established that there was a specific word for it, musahebe, female intimacy, a term that covered a spectrum from close friendship to physical relationship. Ottoman legal texts addressed female same-sex acts with considerably less severity than male same-sex acts, partly because Islamic jurisprudence focused on penetration as the defining sexual act, and partly because what happened between women in a space that men could not enter was, practically speaking, difficult to prosecute. The erasure here was not Ottoman, it was European. When Western historians wrote about the harem in the 19th century, they replaced the complex political and social reality of the institution with a fantasy that served European ideas about Eastern sexuality and European justifications for colonial intervention. The actual lives of the women inside, including their relationships with each other, were buried under layers of Orientalist projection that took historians most of the 20th century to excavate. Finally, let's go to Japan. The Heian period, roughly 794 to 1185 CE, produced one of the most sophisticated court cultures in world history and some of the finest literature ever written. It also produced extensive documentation of emotional and physical relationships between women at court that Japanese scholars have studied carefully and Western historians have largely ignored. Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote The Tale of Genji in the early 11th century, kept a diary that has survived. In this diary, she describes her relationships with other ladies at court in language that moves fluidly between emotional intensity and physical description. She writes about the beauty of specific women, about sleeping beside them, about the particular quality of their presence in a way that later commentators described as the conventional language of court friendship. The conventional language of court friendship in Heian Japan included sleeping together, exchanging intimate poetry, and describing each other's physical appearance with the same vocabulary used in heterosexual love poetry. Whether or not this constitutes what we would call a romantic relationship is a question that Japanese scholars continue to debate. What is not debatable is that these relationships were documented, accepted, and considered entirely compatible with the women's other social roles and obligations. The broader pattern of what the Japanese called nyodo, the way of women, female same-sex love, was documented across the Heian period and into subsequent eras. It was not hidden. It was not illegal. It was not considered incompatible with femininity or with the women's roles as wives, mothers, and court officials. What changed this was, again, external pressure. The Meiji Restoration of the late 19th century brought Western legal and social frameworks into Japan with deliberate speed. Western concepts of homosexuality as pathology, as deviance, as something requiring legal prohibition, arrived alongside Western technology and Western political institutions. The Meiji government did not simply adopt Western law, it adopted Western social categories, and those categories did not have space for nyodo as a neutral or positive phenomenon. The documentation survived, the acknowledgement did not. Here is what connects all of these women across 4,000 years of history in 5 completely different civilizations. None of them were hidden in their own time. Hatshepsut's court knew. Zetian's historians recorded it. Christina's contemporaries understood exactly what she meant when she called Ebba her bed companion. The Ottoman poets wrote about it. The Heian diarists documented it without apparent self-consciousness. The erasure came later. It came with colonialism in some cases, with nationalism in others, with the deliberate construction of a historical narrative that required the past to look a particular way in order to justify the present. The queens are still in the record, incomplete, reframed, pathologized, or simply ignored in the editions that most people read, but present. They were powerful enough that you could not remove them entirely. You could only remove the parts of them that complicated the story someone else wanted to tell. Which means the story is still there. You just have to know where to look.